Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation titled A Tradition of Service, Black Military Presence in Amherstburg with Caitlin McClure, Mary-Katherine Whelan, and myself, Dr. Lorene Bridgen-Lennie. I'm just going to give a bit of a brief bio of each of us before we begin. Caitlin McClure is the Visitor Services Team Leader at Fort Malden National Historic Site and has worked for Parks Canada in varying roles since 2015. She works closely with the Fort's Visitor Experience Team to manage site operations and develop interpretive and educational programming. Caitlin has a Master of Art degree in history from the University of Western Ontario and an Ontario College Graduate Certificate in Museum Management and Curatorship. She has a passion for local history and for sharing the community's stories. Amherstburg Freedom Museum Curator Mary-Katherine Whelan is a graduate from the Museum Management and Curatorship program from Fleming College and the Arts Management program at the University of Toronto. She has been with the Amherstburg Freedom Museum since 2015 and previously worked for the Huron County Museum, National Historic Site Alliance of Ontario, the Stratford Festival of Canada, the Niagara Historical Society, and the Great North Artist Management. I am Assistant Curator, Dr. Lorene Bridgen-Lennie, and I've been with the museum since 2017, and I'm also a Director for the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. I obtained a Bachelor of Arts Honors in History and a Master's of Arts in History from the University of Windsor, in addition to a PhD from the University of Waterloo, where I studied Black Canadian history. Before we begin, we just ask that if you wouldn't mind to turn off your camera and your microphone while we're presenting. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer period, so you can just type in your comments in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. At this point, you're more than welcome to turn on your camera and your microphone. And just one final note, if you would like to support programming such as our Black History Series, you can donate on our website by going to amherstburgfreedom.org. So let's get started. Great. So just a final note before we begin. For today's presentation, the focus is Amherstburg Connections and what is offered in the exhibit, A Tradition of Service, Black Military Presence in Amherstburg, which was a collaboration between the Amherstburg Freedom Museum and Fort Malden. So today's presentation will focus on the exhibit and Amherstburg Connections. And again, this display will be on display in the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. It's open until November the 12th. And we recognize that there are more examples of those from and outside of Amherstburg who fought in the War of 1812 and the Upper Canada Rebellion. But the purpose of today's presentation is to give a broader history of these military campaigns, which will be provided by Caitlin, in addition to narrowing the focus to talk about individual stories, which will be provided by myself and Mary-Katherine. And again, this is not a complete history, but rather a starting point. And we hope that you this can be a starting point for you to learn more. And if anyone that we talk about today, if you know further information or if someone's not mentioned and you want to tell us about their participation, please feel free to contact us through the website, amherstburgfreedom.org. So I'm going to pass it over to Mary-Katherine.
So just reiterating what Lorene said, that this exhibit was produced in collaboration with Fort Malden National Historic Site. This exhibition looks at the history of Black military presence in Amherstburg from 1812 through to 1840. And this exhibit was created in two parts and was displayed across both sites, so at Fort Malden and at the museum, where it currently is on display. So Canadian military history is often whitewashed, but there is a long tradition of military service among Black Canadians who bravely fought to protect their country, dating back to the War 1812 and likely before. We believe that these brave soldiers deserve recognition, which is why we have created this exhibit. We wanted to share information on specific military campaigns, but also narrow the focus to highlight on those who participated, what their experience was like, and why Black Canadians served. We chose to focus on the War of 1812 and the Upper Canada Rebellion because early military campaigns are not often connected to the Black community. It's often more recent battles, such as the First World War and World War II, that this is the focus. We recognize the significance of the First World War and World War II, but think that it is necessary to highlight those who served and laid the foundation for the tradition of military service in the Black community.
Okay. So Fort Malden was designated as a National Historic Site because of the role it played in the defense of Canada during the War of 1812, as well as the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 and 1838. And these are two strong examples of the pre-20th century conflicts that demonstrate the tradition of service that we're talking about today. So for my part, I'm going to provide sort of, as Lorene mentioned, a broader context, giving the story and background information about these two periods of conflict, specifically focusing on this region. And then I'll throw it back to Mary-Katherine and Lorene to delve a little deeper into those individual stories. So to that end, I'm going to start. So there's the commemorative statement of commemorative intent, again, just saying why Fort Malden was designated because of its role. So to that end, I'm going to start chronologically with the War of 1812. So on June 18th, 1812, the United States of America shocked the world by declaring war on the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. I say shocked because at this point, the United States was a relatively young country, not well known in the world, and it was declaring war against one of the biggest powers in the world, Great Britain. In their declaration of war, they outlined three principal causes for declaring war on Great Britain. This included the British naval blockade of France, British impressment of American sailors, and British support of First Nations communities who were impeding American westward expansion. So I'll just delve a little deeper into each of those. So the British naval blockade of France. In the decade leading up to the War of 1812, Europe also found itself in a state of war, with a number of conflicts often collectively known as the Napoleonic Wars. Essentially, France, under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, who controlled most of Europe at this point, pitted himself against Great Britain, who was an island nation protected by her powerful navy. In an effort to weaken the French position, Britain placed restrictions on trade with France and the continent, and used its navy to enforce these restrictions. And this was a huge frustration to the United States, who remained a neutral in this conflict and wished to trade as they pleased. The second cause outlined in the declaration has to do with the impressment of sailors. So forcibly taking sailors from merchant ships for service in the Navy is known as impressment. And because Britain had such a large, powerful Navy, they also needed an enormous number of sailors to operate it. And so as part of their restrictions that they placed on trade with Europe, they also gave themselves the authority to board American ships, partly to search for the cargoes and things that they restricted, but also to take any British naval deserters who might be on the ship, or at least people who they thought were deserters. It's believed that during the Napoleonic Wars, approximately 10,000 American sailors were taken for service into the British Navy, which was a huge violation of American sovereignty. And finally, the third cause has to do with British support of the indigenous peoples on the Western United States frontier. So congressmen from Southern and Western states were convinced that the British Indian Department, so this was the part of the military that was responsible for relationships with indigenous peoples, and they were actually headquartered at Fort Amherstburg, which is the original name of Fort Malden. They believed that they were actively aiding the tribes of the Great Lakes area in their resistance to the United States expansion into their traditional homelands. And so they felt that if they declared war on Great Britain and they were able to remove them from the continent, it would have a much easier time expanding because that aid would be taken away. So that essentially is why the Americans declared war on the British. Now there is, of course, the question of how they would confront this strong power nation on the other side of the world who controlled the sea. The answer, of course, was to invade the British North American settlements of Upper and Lower Canada, which many believed was going to be an easy feat, a mere matter of marching, as the former President Thomas Jefferson said. And they truly did believe that the Canadians would welcome them as sort of liberators, a second revolution, as it were. But unfortunately for the Americans, this was not the case. Battles were fought along the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, and even along the United States coast, all the way down to Louisiana. For today's presentation, however, I'm just going to stick to that Detroit frontier and the action here at Fort Amherstburg, or Fort Malden. So Amherstburg saw some of the first actions of the war, including the capture of the Cuyahoga and the skirmish at River Canard. So the Cuyahoga story. In anticipation of war, the United States started mobilizing its forces along the border, including Detroit. So in the spring of 1812, Brigadier General William Hall, who was also the governor of Michigan Territory, began marching the Army of the Northwest from Cleveland to Detroit. And travel through Ohio was not easy. There weren't many roads, so making your way through forests and swamps was quite difficult. And so on July 2nd, he actually commandeered a small packet, or hired a small packet known as the Cuyahoga, to send his sick soldiers, his band of music, his luggage, all the stuff that had been weighing them down. Unfortunately for Hull, he was not aware that war had been declared, and so when the Cuyahoga passed Amherstburg, it was immediately captured by the Provincial Marine, who were stationed in King's Navy Yard in Amherstburg. So not only was this an early victory for the British, but the information found, including Hull's invasion plans in his personal luggage, proved very useful for the garrison at Fort Malden or Fort Amherstburg. The next sort of confrontation would be the skirmishes at River Canard. So eventually Hull did make it to Detroit, and despite his loss of the Cuyahoga, he continued with his plans for invasion, entering Sandwich on July 12th and setting up a fortified military position in the town. A few days later, he would send an American force towards Amherstburg south. And at the River Canard, they were met by 2 British soldiers on guard, Privates John Dean and James Hancock of the 41st Regiment. A small skirmish broke out, and resulting in Fort Amherstburg's first casualties of the war. But fortunately for the British, this confrontation stalled Americans long enough for them to protect the River Canard and prevent any further advancement. The next few months saw a number of victories, including a small battle in McGuagan and Brownstown in the Michigan Territory, which threatened Hull's supply lines and actually forced him to leave Sandwich back to the safety of Fort Detroit. The height of British success along the Detroit frontier was reached in mid-August of 1812 with the arrival of Major General Isaac Brock and the capture of Fort Detroit. So Brock arrived on August 13th and immediately met with the Shawnee chief Tecumseh to plan their attack on the American fort. On August 14th, they set up artillery in the newly liberated Sandwich to start bombarding the fort, and on August 16th, they made their full assault, using a few ruse de guerre, including magnifying the threat of Tecumseh's First Nations warriors, as well as dressing militia in redcoats to magnify the regular troops. Brock was able to force Hull's surrender, resulting in the capture of the fort, Michigan Territory, as well as the relief army that was on its way from Ohio. So with the Detroit frontier under British control, Brock did leave for the Niagara region shortly thereafter, and he would eventually be killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights. I didn't put my slide along. Sorry about that. So now we're going to get into 1813 and sort of the end of British success here. So the success would continue in the early months of 1813 with the victory at the Battle of Frenchtown or River Raisin. However, the tide would quickly turn with a new American commander, Henry Harrison, replacing William Hull, and the construction of new defensive posts in Ohio, such as Fort Meigs. In the spring and summer of 1813, forces from Amherstburg, accompanied by Indigenous allies, continued the offensive, attacking Fort Meigs twice, once in April and once in July, as well as Fort Stevenson in August. The strategy, however, was a complete failure, ultimately diminishing Fort Amherstburg's supplies and the morale of the troops. Further, these losses were further compounded by American victories in Fort York, as well as Fort George, and the launch of the American fleet on the Great Lakes, effectively cutting off supply lines for Amherstburg. The fall of 1813 would see the last major engagements Fort Malden would be involved in for the remainder of the war. With supply lines cut and rations dwindling, the decision was made to launch the fleet from Amherstburg in hopes of defeating the American Navy and reopening those supply lines. On September 9th, 1813, under the command of Robert Barclay, the Royal Navy set sail from Amherstburg. And despite the British Navy being one of the most powerful in the world at this time, the fleet from Amherstburg wasn't really up to this standard. With no supplies coming in, the ships had to be stocked with weapons and artillery from the fort. Actually, they stripped the fort of its artillery to man the vessels. And similarly, with few sailors available, they actually manned the ships with regular soldiers from the 41st Regiment who had only ever been on a boat, most of them once in their life when they actually came to Canada. On September 10th, the Battle of Lake Erie began, and within a day, an American victory was achieved. With the fleet captured, Fort Amherstburg was left defenseless, and with few arms or rations to support the troops and the Indigenous allies that had gathered there in Amherstburg. British Commander Henry Proctor made the difficult decision to abandon Amherstburg and retreat towards Burlington. So on September 23rd, 1813, Fort Amherstburg, as well as the public buildings in Amherstburg and Sandwich, were burned to the ground, and the troops, along with their Indigenous allies and loyal Amherstburg residents, began on the retreat. Not everybody was satisfied with this decision to abandon Amherstburg. Particularly Chief Tecumseh and his First Nations allies wanted to stand and fight, and he actually gave a very powerful speech to this end. And so there was a compromise made that although they were retreating, at some point along the way, they would stop and make a stand. And this moment came on October 5th at the Battle of Moraviantown, where the American army caught up with the retreating British and actually defeated them. They killed Tecumseh and ultimately eliminated the British from this region until the end of the war. So while there were battles, and obviously the fighting continued on until actually 1815, that sort of ended the Amherstburg story. The Americans occupied Fort Amherstburg until July of 1815, when it was actually returned and as part of the negotiations that started in December of 1814. So that's a very quick overview of the War of 1812 here in Amherstburg. Pretty significant conflict for many reasons, but it really helped to shape the Canadian identity effectively, defining our distinctiveness from the United States, especially among Canadians and the militia who served in the conflict. All right, so now I'm going to sort of jump ahead a couple of decades and talk about Fort Malden and the Upper Canada Rebellion. So unlike a war like the War of 1812, where there's an official declaration and a formalization of causes as well as official end, it's kind of harder to pinpoint the exact causes and outcomes of a rebellion. There are often many groups, each sort of capitalizing this with their own motivations and agendas, capitalizing on the general feeling of unrest in the population. The Upper Canada Rebellion is no different. That being said, we can certainly see tie it to some overall factors causing unease in the community. A large part being, of course, the economic depression that hit both the lower and upper Canada at this time. Farms were failing, businesses were failing, and as we see throughout history, certainly economic depressions can have a huge effect on the populace. This was further compounded by the fact that the government seemed to be controlled by a small group of upper-class businessmen known as the Family Compact, whose decisions seemed to favor their business interests rather than the greater good. And particularly, people were upset with things like the construction of canals when a lot of the other infrastructure was failing. Roads between Windsor and Toronto, for example, looked worse than they had 20 years earlier during the War of 1812. Few railways had been constructed, and little support was given to local farmers. And it was really a hard contrast compared to the booming infrastructure in Detroit. The Canadian side of the river actually looked very different, or very little had changed since the 1790s. Insurrection in Lower Canada also helped to prompt the rebellion that would take place here a few months later. So probably the biggest and sort of spark for the powder keg of the Upper Canada Rebellion is Montgomery's Tavern. So on December 7th, 1837, William Lyon Mackenzie with about 400 other men gathered at Montgomery's Tavern in Toronto to protest the colonial government. The group was quickly dispersed by the better equipped local militia. However, their action sparked a series of battles throughout Upper Canada. that would sort of define this conflict. A number of these battles were fought here in Essex County, where there were many Americans who supported the idea of a Canadian Republic, and so offered a lot of aid. Unlike the War of 1812, where a large part of the battles were fought in this region by British regulars, the fort was already manned in 1812. The majority of the battles here, especially in the beginning, were fought by the local militia, with the regulars having left in 1836. So the first of these battles is the Schooner Anne. In January of 1838, excuse me, Canadian rebels, aided by American sympathizers, commandeered the Schooner Anne as well as other vessels in arms in Detroit with the intention of seizing Amherstburg. They actually captured Bois Island or Bois Blanc Island for a period, and then on January 9th, they actually started bombarding the town, creating much panic. The militia quickly returned fire and ultimately captured the boat, its crew, and arms. The next battle would be at Fighting Island in February, about a month later, where a few hundred patriots captured the island, but were quickly removed by the British regiment who had now arrived and the Essex militia. The third sort of battle in this area, it was in March of that year, with British forces actually marching across a frozen Lake Erie to Pelee Island, again, quickly disrupting the rebel plans. The final battle that sort of falls under the umbrella of the Upper Canada Rebellion in this region was the Battle of Windsor in December of 1838, when rebels crossing from Detroit quickly took the barracks in Windsor and caused quite a bit of chaos in the town, but they were shortly put down by the Essex militia from Sandwich. So ultimately, the rebellions were a military failure, and most of the captured rebels were sent to penal colonies in Australia and New Zealand. However, it did result in the reconstruction of Fort Malden. So because of the unrest, they actually did flood quite a bit of money back and British regulars back to Fort Malden and rebuilt the fort. On a grander scale, it also led to the commission of the Durham Report to investigate the unrest in this area, which ultimately recommended responsible government, which is what the people of the rebels, the Canadians, were hoping for, and eventually introduced steps to Confederation. So that is a very, I realize I didn't click that again. Sorry. So that is a very quick overview of the War of 1812 and Upper Canada rebellions in this area, and I'll throw it back to Lorene and MK to sort of delve a little deeper.
Okay, so before we talk about, but thank you so much, Caitlin, first of all, for that, especially since you had to kind of breeze through it a little bit, but that was thorough despite it being a quick time frame. But Mary-Katherine and I are going to take over now and talk about individual stories. But before we talk about a few of the individuals connected to these, to the War of 1812 and the Upper Canada Rebellion, we feel like it's important to talk about reasons why these soldiers would serve. The tradition of military service by Black Canadians goes back long before Confederation. Among the battles fought by Black Canadians are the War of 1812 and the Upper Canada Rebellion, as we just, as Caitlin just talked about. We feel, again, that it is necessary to explain why Black Canadians would choose to fight despite the racism that they experienced in Canada. And this is not a complete picture. There were some soldiers who fought for other reasons. Some chose not to fight at all. But we believe that these are some of the main reasons why a soldier would fight in these military campaigns. And again, too, in terms of, we're mentioning here the racism that Black Canadians and persons of African descent in Canada experienced. Canada is often seen as the promised land, but there was actually significant racism and discrimination that the Black community that they had to face while they lived in this country. So again, we're just going to talk about reasons why they would fight despite that. So Mary-Katherine will talk about the first one.
One of the reasons for serving was expression of gratitude. So following the abolition of slavery in Canada in 1834, once freedom seekers touched Canadian soil, they were free and British citizens. Black Canadians were not only grateful for their emancipation from enslavement, but they also felt indebted to the opportunity to build a new life in Canada as free persons. Military service in Upper Canada Rebellion was one of the ways in which they were able to express their gratitude.
Now, another reason could be it was a respectable symbol of British or Canadian loyalty. We say Canadian, but I mean, at the time, they would have been British subjects, but just to use a more current term, Canadian loyalty. But unfortunately, damaging stereotypes followed freedom seekers to Canada at no fault of their own, and white residents forced these negative stereotypes back on to freedom seekers. So, for example, that they were uneducated, unskilled, dependent, unmotivated, a drain on society. Now we know that this is absolutely false, but at the time, white residents did force these negative opinions back onto the Black community. And this negatively impacted the community's reputation, and as a result, and resulted in hateful acts of racism towards this community. The more their loyalty in terms of the Black community serving was put on display, the harder it was for opposition to question their rights as British citizens, and also it allowed them to question their ability to be self-sufficient. So I mean, we don't want to say that it convinced everyone, but we believe that it did give a small portion of the population, or a portion of the population, some consideration, and maybe questioning, well, maybe if they're serving for their country, they were loyal, they are motivated, and they're skilled individuals. So we believe that it was through military service they could help challenge these negative stereotypes. And military service was a respectable symbol of British loyalty that aided them in altering some, again, some, not all, negative perceptions about the Black community. So again, we want to be realistic here. We know that there were some people who just, no matter what, would not have changed their mind or their opinion towards the Black community. But military service was a respectable symbol that the Black community could use to help challenge that.
So another reason for serving was visual example. So visible displays of loyalty and service, including enlisted in the military, wearing of a uniform, participating in military parades, recognition printed on headstones. Visual examples of military service challenged the perception that the Black community lacked a high sense of duty to their country, and also demonstrated to the mainstream society that Black Canadians were one of us and had adapted and were accepted, they had accepted British traditions.
So the next reason would be instilling a sense of self-respect among Black Canadians and persons of African descent living in Canada. Military service also instilled a sense of self-respect that elevated them beyond the negative ideas that were forced upon them under enslavement or the racism that they endured as free persons. Now, it's important to remember that an enslaved person, sadly, their enslaver would have indoctrinated them to believe that the purpose that they served was to serve their enslaver. And so this mindset, I'm sure, really would have worn away at that individual. And so performing military service would uplift them and instill a sense of self-respect. And fighting in military campaigns allowed for the Black soldiers to contribute to the progress and safety of their home, but it also helped to create a positive self-image among Black residents and also among their families as well, because it was a sense of pride. It was a feeling of pride among family members as well, that one of their family members was serving as well. So it could extend not just to the individual soldier, but to their family members as well.
So now I'm going to just talk about Black experience. So despite their service, some residents did not change their racist attitudes, as Lorene had previously mentioned, towards Black residences. A fluid frontier, slavery, resistance, and the Underground Railroad in Detroit River borderland illustrates that Black men were willing to fight for the British, but were still seen as a threat. In the article, Canadian Black Settlements in Detroit River Region, author Irene Moore Davis writes, in December of 1837, during the 1837-38 Mackenzie Rebellion, the Reverend Josiah Hensen's company of Black volunteers attached to the Essex militia was part of the group that captured the rebel schooner Anne and made prisoners of its crew. Josiah Hensen's unit defended Fort Malden in Amherstburg from Christmas of 1837 to May 1838, and another company of 123 black volunteers of Captain Caldwell's Colored Corps was subsequently stationed there for 2 months. The black volunteers showed such bravery that Lieutenant Governor Sir Francis Bondhead commented on their service in his remarks to the legislature of Upper Canada in March of 1838. Even so, interracial relations in Amherstburg were not entirely rosy. In 1835, paranoid white residents petitioned the government of Upper Canada not to remove British troops from Fort Malden, fearing that they would be left defenseless against the very numerous and troublesome black populations, who are almost daily violating the laws, end quote.
And to speak to what Mary-Katherine, the quote she just read, the fact that these men were willing to serve and sacrifice their lives, and still there were individuals who weren't willing to change their opinions about the Black community and their service, I think it speaks volumes. It just really does demonstrate that no matter what these individuals were doing at the time, there's just some that just wouldn't change their mind, even if someone sacrificed their own life to serve their country and to protect it. So I can imagine an incredibly frustrating position to be in. So now we're going to move on to talk about individual stories. We want to narrow the focus. I mean, Caitlin did such a great job at showing the broader picture, and we've talked about why individuals could possibly have fought. But now we feel like it's really important to put a face or a name to those individuals who fought and recognize them for their service. So the first person we're going to talk about is Richard Pierpoint, and we're going to talk about the War of 1812. Now, I do recognize that we said that the focus of the presentation is Amherstburg. We have very few examples connected to the War of 1812. Mary-Katherine's going to talk about someone in just a few minutes, but we thought that it was really important to mention Richard Pierpoint because oftentimes when people think about the War of 1812, they don't often tend to consider the contributions of Black Canadians, but when they do, Richard Pierpoint is usually the first person that comes to mind. So we thought that even though we don't know of any Amherstburg connections or direct connections, we thought that it was really important to give you a little bit of background information because he's such a significant figure in that campaign. So I'm going to give a little bit of background information on him first. So he was born circa 1744 in Bondu, which is now Senegal, and he fought in both the American Revolution and the War of 1812. In 1760, at the age of 16, he was captured and enslaved and remained so for roughly 20 years. And although it is unclear how he gained his freedom, it is believed that his participation in the American Revolution earned him his freedom. He was likely promised his freedom for fighting with the British. In 1780, Pierpoint was part of the Loyalist unit Butler's Rangers and was stationed in the Niagara region, likely Fort Niagara, where he, along with the unit, fought against the Americans in the American Revolution. Pierpoint was later honorably discharged, and in 1791, he was granted 200 acres of land in St. Catharines. But there was a condition. In order to be recognized as the official landowner, Pierpoint had to clear and develop the land by a certain date, which would have been incredibly difficult to do. This is why a petition called the Petition of Free Negroes was created. And some believe that it was Pierpoint himself who actually wrote this petition. The petition was sent to Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe and asked that Black settlers be able to settle next to each other so that they could establish a community and work collectively to clear the land. It also asked that they be allowed to live on a tract of land separate from white settlers, which to us clearly demonstrates the significant discrimination that Black Canadians endured, or persons of African descent living in Canada endured, that they would want to live separately from the white settlers. Sadly, the Executive Council of Upper Canada rejected the petition, and despite this, though, he wins in the end. Pierpoint was actually able to clear his land and in the designated time frame, and he became the official owner in 1804. But again, this does really highlight the challenges that many Black settlers faced. I mean, his wish was to live separately with other Black settlers and was denied his request. So, which again clearly points out the discrimination that Black settlers must have faced from white settlers. So again, it just really highlights the challenges that the Black community and Black settlers faced at the time. Pierpont, the point of this presentation is the War of 1812 and Upper Canada Rebellion, so we're going to talk about his participation in the War of 1812. He also fought in that battle, and he fought after, at the age of 68, he petitioned for the creation of an all-Black militia to fight for the British against the United States. He fought in Captain Robert Brunchy's Corps of Colored Men, which was a militia that consisted of free Black men. And members of this militia, they fought in campaign or battles such as the Battle of Queenston Heights, the Battle of Fort George, and the Battle of Stony Creek. And this next slide just does really illustrate the importance of Richard Pierpont and the fact that he is still being recognized to this day. It was just very recently that Parks Canada and the Historic Sites and Monument Board of Canada unveiled the national commemorative plaque honoring Richard Pierpont, which is on display in Fergus, Ontario. So again, this really does emphasize the fact that people are still recognizing his significance into the present. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Mary-Katherine, who's going to talk about the next individual, John Stokes.
So as Lorene mentioned, we are going to just talk briefly about John Stokes. Did you know that Amherstburg residents named John Stokes also participated in the War of 1812? According to the Black presence in the War of 1812, Unsung Military Volunteers of North America, written by historian Elise Harding Davis, John Stokes, a Black veteran in the War of 1812, was granted land on garrison grounds in Amherstburg, Ontario. This property was claimed by John and passed down through generations of his family. In a newspaper article titled Days of Slavery Still Seem Real, an interview with John Stokes' descendant Peter emphasizes the Stokes family's fight for freedom and the importance of protecting it. In the article, it says that Peter A. Stokes from 112 King Street, Amherstburg, brings out an old muzzle-loaded rifle and handmade knife, brandishes both when the subject of freedom is broached. Born in 1870, he has never for one moment lost sight of the value of being a free man. My grandfather was beaten to death in the United States, he says. My father was a slave in Kentucky and ran away with his whole family because he wanted to be free. This is the gun he carried with them. It claimed 3 lives in my father's fight for freedom. And you can also learn more about the Stokes family on our website at amherstburgfreedom.org/family-histories. The article continues with, this knife also did its part. Both the knife and the gun would be used again if freedom were ever threatened. Freedom means everything to us. It means life. I'd just as soon be dead or die fighting rather than be a slave the way my father and his folks were.
And also, again, just to speak to Peter Stokes, we, of course, Mary-Katherine mentioned he didn't fight in the War of 1812, but it really does show this continuation of the value of freedom in the Stokes family and their willingness to protect it at any cost. So we're going to move on to talk about the Upper Canada Rebellion. In all, approximately 1,000 Black volunteers fighting in 5 companies helped put down the uprising during the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837-38. And the first person we're going to talk about is John Joseph Mulder. He was born enslaved in Maryland, and he escaped to Canada in the early 1800s and settled in Colchester circa 1810. He served in Captain Caldwell's company of colored volunteers, and following the rebellion in 1839, John and his wife Emily purchased 40 acres of farmland on Gore Road, and many of their descendants still reside in Essex County to this day. And this is an image of the pay list for Captain Caldwell's company. And you'll notice there's an asterisk next to John Mulder's name. And I think that it's important that we state that this presentation is not just about mentioning the direct connections of individuals to their military campaigns, but also their lives as well. What happened after they served. We think that it's important to share as many details as we possibly can about these individuals. And just like the Stokes family, you can read more about the Mulder family on our website as well in the Family History series.
So now I'm going to talk about Josiah Hensen more in depth. We mentioned him earlier, and we have here he's pictured with his wife Nancy. Josiah Hensen was born enslaved in Charles County, Maryland in 1789. Hensen, his wife Nancy, and their children arrived in Upper Canada in 1830. Upon arriving in Canada, Hensen said, "I will use my freedom well." He was a driving force behind the establishment of the Black settlement called Dawn near Dresden, Ontario, which assisted freedom seekers in establishing their new lives. And it's also the site of the Josiah Hensen Museum of African Canadian History. He also attended the 1851 North American Convention held in Toronto, which was organized by newspaperman Henry Bibb. Hensen also acted as chairman at the 1853 General Convention held in Amherstburg, which brought together delegates to discuss issues including agriculture, temperance, and education. According to Hensen's autobiography, Uncle Tom's Story of His Life, during the Upper Canada Rebellion, he was captain of the 2nd Essex Company of Colored Volunteers, which assisted in defending Fort Malden between Christmas of 1837 and May of 1838, and successfully captured the rebels' schooner Anne. According to Hensen, they captured all it carried, which were 300 arms, 2 cannons, musketry, and provisions for the rebel troops. This was a fierce and gallant action, and it did much towards breaking up the rebel party, for they could not obtain provisions while we held the fort. The colored men were willing to help defend the government that had given them a home when they had fled from slavery. And you can also read more about Josiah Hensen's life in his autobiography, Uncle Tom's Story of His Life.
The next person that we're going to talk about is Jeremiah Harris. He was born in Kentucky in 1807, but the date of his arrival in Canada is unknown. Harris served in Captain Nelson's 3rd Essex Colored Militia, which was supposedly present at Elliott's Point during the capture of the rebel schooner Anne. And for anyone who isn't familiar with the location of Elliott's Point in Amherstburg, it's where the old bobloat docks used to be, and there is a plaque across the road that talks about the capture of the schooner Anne as well, if you're looking to visit it on the waterfront. Jeremiah Harris was especially known for his teamster work on the streets of Amherstburg, particularly during snowy winter months. According to the local newspaper, the Amherstburg Echo, Jeremiah Harris and his team of 2 powerful horses were under contract with the town to scrape and sweep the streets of the burg in the summer and clear snow in the winter. Another position he held was dog catcher for the area. And Mary-Katherine did mention this quote previously, but the Black volunteers showed such bravery that Lieutenant Governor Sir Francis Bond had commented on their service in his remarks to the legislature of Upper Canada in March 1838. And it's certainly possible as well. We believe that these men who served would have been likely given land as well for their service, some, not all, but it is certainly a possibility. And you can also learn more about the Harris family on our website as part of the Family History series. And we'd mentioned some details about their military service, but also personal details. Unfortunately, we don't have all the information on these individuals. We're sharing as much as we can. And there's more information on the Family History series. But again, some information is just unknown to us, but we feel that it's important to talk about both their military service and their personal lives as well.
So next we're going to talk about Levi Simpson. The pay list of the Captain Caldwell's Company of Colored Volunteers at Amherstburg on militia duty from 29th of December of 1837 to the 25th of January 1838, inclusive list Levi Simpson Sr., so you can see where the asterisk is. He's listed on that list. He was born in Kentucky, and according to our records, his mother was enslaved while his father was white. He later married Elizabeth Hutchinson, who was born in Manchester, England, and Levi and Elizabeth's children include Levi Jr., Mary Ann, William H., George, Elizabeth, Victoria, Susanna, Nancy, Amy, Eliza, and Hala. And you can also learn more about the Simpson family by visiting our website.
So this next image is showing part of the exhibit, and these are prints by Garth Dietrich, and they were commissioned by Parks Canada in the 1980s. And we're showing this because these prints were basically the beginning point of this exhibit being created. We were approached by Parks Canada, and they'd mentioned that they had these prints, and they wanted to work with us to create some kind of an exhibit or presentation. And so we worked with Caitlin to create this exhibit that surrounds these prints.
Yeah, and I
And
just
so-
wanted to say thank you to Mary-Katherine and Lorene for letting us be a part of this. Fort Malden is a pretty small historic site, and so we like to, as much as we can, work with other heritage organizations in the community. And it's collaborations like these that allow us to share resources like the prints, share them, but also for us to help tell the stories that aren't always represented in our daily interpretations at the fort. So the resources that you guys have that have allowed us to combine with these prints have just been awesome. So thank you for that.
And so for those who aren't able to make it out to the exhibit before it closes, we've included some images that will give you a better sense of what is included in the exhibit. So there's just a couple of photos we'll show you. So we wanted to just first say thank you to Caitlin and Fort Malden for working with us to create this exhibit, and also for Caitlin joining us today for this presentation. And also thank you to you, our audience, for joining us and for exploring our country's rich and significant Black history. So I don't know if there's any comments or questions, or Mary-Katherine, if you had anything to add before we move on.
No.
Okay.
If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can allow you to speak if you'd like to speak. If not, there's no pressure.
Yep, no pressure to ask a question. Okay, well, I think we'll just leave it at that. But if you do have any questions that you want to ask us, please feel free to reach out to us through our website, amherstburgfreedom.org. Maybe you know of someone who was mentioned in this. Maybe they're your ancestor and you want to share further information for us. We always welcome information from the public. We want to make sure that we give the most accurate picture and most expansive picture possible about this significant history. So if you know of someone who was mentioned today, or someone who wasn't mentioned today, and you'd like us to add further information, we would love to hear from you. So again, just reach out to us through amherstburgfreedom.org. And again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today.
Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.